not Thursday at 5 p.m., it's Tuesday at 1 p.m., and this will be the time.
But this is a new business, right?
Weekly seminar. Yes, we will move in space in addition to time, but this will take a few more months, weeks, I don't know. And today's seminar is special because it's part of the Stellar series, and therefore I would ask our director, Professor Eli Nelken, to introduce the speaker.
Okay, so I'm very happy to be part of this renewal of the ESSEC seminar at a different time. As Yoram said, a different space will happen later. For those of you who don't know, the seminar took place on Thursday at 5 p.m. since 1992. So it's a historical moment. I'm happy to introduce our lecturer, Professor Christine Petit. She is a professor at the Pasteur Institute in Paris and also at the Collège de France. I give a much longer introduction tomorrow as part of the traditional long introduction to the Heller lecture, but I would just like to say that I know of Christine many, many years. She's one of the greatest names in the genetics of audition. A few years back we met for the first time very happily, and I'm very happy that she accepted our invitation to Jerusalem. Please, Christine.
So good afternoon, everyone, and many thanks to Eli Nelken for inviting me. I am particularly pleased to have the opportunity to interact with you in the LSC and also to admire the new building. I heard that you will be there in 6 weeks. So I'll discuss the genetic dissection of mechanism underlying sound detection and perception. So as you all know, during the course of human evolution, an unparalleled ability to make sense of sounds emerged, culminating with the development of language and music. This elevated hearing to its unique status as the primary sense of human communication. Hearing involves the detection, the identification, and the localization of any element vibrating at an audible frequency. It also involves, let's say, the deciphering, the analysis of the auditory scene, and like the other senses, it contributes this way to the survival of animals through the detection of prey and predators, for example. However, it explores wider space, and it is highly sensitive to rapid change in the sensory scene. The sensitivity of hearing, like the sensitivity of all sensory systems, had increased during evolution to a maximum level. For instance, we can detect a single photon with the visual system, and the auditory system is doing roughly the same thing, since it is able to detect an acoustic energy barely exceeding the thermal noise. However, I think that this temporal acuity is really the remarkable characteristic of the auditory system, the temporal precision of the way it works. So its temporal acuity differs from one auditory function to the others, and one of the best examples is the way we are able to localize low-frequency sound source in the azimuthal plane, in which coincidence detector neurons in humans are able to detect a delay of only 10 to 15 microseconds. So, during this talk, I will show how the genetic dissection has emerged as a gateway to the molecular mechanism underlying the development and the functioning of the auditory system, how the hundreds of causal genes for deafness and their corresponding animal models have revealed the molecular basis of sound detection and processing, so far mainly in the cochlea. And I will focus on hair cell and especially on two of its compartments, the ear bundle, its sensory antenna, and its synapse. Then I will focus on recent results challenging the view that inherited deafness forms are of peripheral origin only. This result potentially extends the genetic dissection to the auditory cortex with the identification of neuronal population of this cortex, and in the future the possibility to study their functional connectivity. And finally, I will consider how pleiotropic function of deafness gene, maybe I will just discuss this point with you, will affect future therapy and also the way to address the evolution of this sensory system. So, in the early 1990s, a long time ago, much was already known about the biophysics and the physiology of the peripheral auditory system, mainly thanks to physicists. But the way the molecular, let's say, mechanism underlying sound processing in the peripheral auditory system was virtually unknown. This situation arose mainly from the fact that the cochlea contained very small number of cells for each cochlear cell type. So because of this, this precludes any biochemical analysis to get access to this molecular mechanism and even classical molecular genetic approaches. This is why we evaluated the genetic approach as a promising way to get access to this molecular mechanism, because basically the genetic approach has an efficiency which is totally independent to the number of molecules encoded by the gene sought. So we decided to undertake a genetic dissection of the auditory system by pulling the gene responsible for sensory neural deafness in humans. We were not interested to the outer ear and the middle ear. So we began looking for genes, these genes, by studying large families affected by profound deafness. Profound deafness, the inherited forms, are inherited on autosomal recessive mode. So they are highly prevalent in consanguineous families. This is why we decided to try to collaborate with ENTs and geneticists working in countries in which the consanguinity is very high. We focus on profound form of deafness because this form can only be on sensory neural origin. To minimize the probability of having several deafness genes segregating in the same families, we worked in geographic isolates, and because geographic isolates have generally been founded by a small number of individuals, so we could expect in such families, in such large families, to have a single deafness gene segregating. So what you can see here at the bottom is the pedigree of the first family we work on. It contains no fewer than 200 individuals, and these individuals were located in geographic isolates in North Tunisia. This way, we map to human chromosome the first gene responsible for profound, congenital, autosomal recessive inherited forms of deafness. Not surprisingly, these particular genes turn out to be responsible for the most frequent cause of congenital profound deafness in humans. It encodes connexin 26. So we rapidly extended our study to families from South Tunisia and also from Morocco, Algeria, Jordan, and Lebanon. So the genetic linkage strategy that we developed proved out to be extremely fruitful. Several labs subsequently identified other loci responsible for deafness, and at that time, at least initially, the genome sequence was unknown. So we decided to try to pull candidate gene for deafness. We developed the working hypothesis that genes which are highly expressed or exclusively expressed in the cochlea likely play a critical role in this organ, and that when defective they should lead to deafness. This way, we pull out these candidate genes, we map them on our loci for deafness, and we started to identify quite rapidly a large number of deafness genes. We could name them because at that time the corresponding proteins were not known, and we named them autogelin, autoancorin, autoferlin, stereosilin, harmonine, pegvakin, and so on. I'll stop. Okay. Today, thanks to the effort of numerous laboratories worldwide, more than 100 genes responsible for isolated deafness, meaning in deafness, let's say in form of deafness, in which hearing impairment is a sole symptom. So more than 100 of genes have already been identified. And in addition, about 300 to 400 genes responsible for syndromic form of deafness, in which deafness is associated with other symptoms. Still, many genes remain to be identified, but they are responsible for rare or very rare cases of deafness. So, how to decipher the role of the protein encoded by deafness genes? Right from the start, it was clear that it will be absolutely impossible to understand the role of the protein encoded by this deafness gene in humans. Why is that? Because there is no possibility to directly observe the cochlea in humans, contrary to what can be done at the level of the retina. This is a real problem. And also, the auditory testing, the auditory clinical tests, give rather poor information so far, or let's say, have not been developed to the extent that they could be to provide very important information. So we rely entirely on mouse models for human deafness to understand the role of the protein encoded by deafness genes. And we were fortunate in the sense that mouse model, in other words, in animal models in which the same gene which is responsible for deafness in humans has been inactivated, faithfully mimic, as far as we can tell, the hearing defect observed in patients. Their multidisciplinary analysis of this mouse model led to a main conclusion that all the inherited forms of deafness which have been analyzed so far are due to cochlear defect or defects taking place in the afferent neuron of the hair cells. So, I'll very briefly introduce the peripheral auditory system. Here is the inner ear with the cochlea and the vestibular apparatus. Next, a section of the cochlea. And next, the neuroepithelium. Sound induces vibration of the neuroepithelium. It results in the deflection of a structure which is located at the apex of the hair cell and which is called the hair bundle. The hair bundle is composed of microvillar structure that you see here, which are protrusions, actile fin protrusions, which are organized in 3 rows of increasing height. These stereocilia are connected within the hair bundle, as we will see, by several fibrous links. For the time being, I will focus on one of them, which is called the tip link. The tip link here in red and green. The tip link is at the heart of the mechanotransduction machinery, the machinery which converts acoustic energy into electrical signal. You can see it here also. So, now, when sounds induce the vibration of the neuroepithelium of the cochlea, the hair bundle at the apex of the hair cell, the sensory hair cell, oscillate. In fact, you have to imagine that it oscillates, not in one direction, in the 2 directions. When the deflection is generated in the direction of the highest row of stereocilia, this creates a tension in the tip link that propagates up to the mechanotransduction channels, which are force-gated channels, which are located here at the apex of the small and medium stereocilia row. As a result of this tension, these channels open, catch an influx in the cells, and depolarize the cells. So, in the neuroepithelium, there are two types of sensory cells. The inner air cell, which I like to say are the genuine sensory cells. Because contrary to the outer air cell, they talk to the brain, they encode acoustic information and transfer this acoustic information to the afferent neuron. In contrast, the outer air cells almost do not talk to the brain, they receive efferent innervation, they are cochlear amplifiers. As a response of the stimulation of the air bundle at the apex of the inner air cell, the neurotransmitter, let's say the depolarization, will lead to the release of the neurotransmitter, the glutamate, at the synaptic level, of course. Okay. The main message is the following one. Most of the proteins encoded by deafness genes are sensory air cell proteins. And all of these proteins are located in hair cell compartments which have specific function in these cells. First of all, at the level of cell-cell junction between the hair cell and the supporting cell. This is of no surprise because the neuroepithelium, the auditory neuroepithelium, is continuously stimulated by the mechanical stress of sound. As a result, the junction between the hair cell and the supporting cell are very different from the standard, apical junction of an epithelium. A number of the proteins which are involved in this cell-cell junction, when defective, lead to deafness. Among these hair cell proteins, some are responsible for anomaly at the level of this, concerning the neurotransmitter release. And some of them are responsible for a specific class of auditory defects which are called auditory neuropathy. And finally, as you can see here, the vast majority of the protein encoded by the genes are located within the air bundle. And through this protein, they help to solve the way, let's say, the shaping of the air bundle is occurring during the development of the air cell, how this air bundle is orientated. This also helps to understand how the growth of the stereocilia to obtain the staircase pattern of the stereocilia row is developed, and it has been absolutely essential to get access to the component of the mechanoelectrical transduction machinery. So this is not an overstatement to say that so far all we know about the molecular mechanism of hearing in the cochlea and in afferent neurons is due to the gene defective in deafness. Okay, I'd like now to briefly concentrate on the air bundle links. Surely one of the least expected findings due to the genetic approach was the fact that these deafness genes pointed, let's say, the importance of lateral links and not only of the tip links present in the air bundle. These lateral links, first of all, not all had been identified before, but some are embryonic links connecting together the stereocilia. Some are ankle links being present only at the base of the stereocilia. Some are only present in the outer air cell and are called top connectors. And thanks to the genetic approach, we could show the following things. First of all, we concentrated on a syndromic form of deafness, which is called Usher syndrome. Usher syndrome is the most frequent cause of inherited deafness associated with blindness, and it has 3 subtypes. We concentrated on Usher 1 syndrome, in which the hearing impairment is the most severe, it is severe to profound and congenital. There are some vestibular dysfunction being associated and retinitis pigmentosa appearing before puberty. These are all monogenic forms of deafness, and we have been deeply involved in pulling out the gene responsible for Usher syndrome type 1. Altogether, presently we have the following picture. The 5 genes responsible for Usher syndrome type 1 encode for 2 of them a transmembrane calcium adhesion molecule called cadherin 23 and another one called protocadherin 15. They are very unusual by the number of extracellular cadherin repeats they possess. Cadherin 23 has 27 extracellular repeats and protocadherin 15 has 11 repeats. They differ also from conventional cadherin, E-cadherin for instance, by the presence, the absence first of all, of a binding to catenin and the presence of a signal called a PDZ domain binding site, which is present in all of these molecules except in one. The 2 other molecules are scaffolding protein, one we call harmonine and which has several PDZ domains within, and another one we call SANS, which are 4 ankyrin repeats. These are scaffolding proteins. And the last one, which has in fact the first protein responsible for Usher syndrome type 1 we pull out, encodes myosin 7A. So, based on the similarity of the hearing defect and the visual defect in Usher 1 syndrome type 1 affected patients, we developed the working hypothesis that likely the causal genes responsible for Usher syndrome type 1 encode proteins which are involved in the same pathway, and why not forming a given complex. First of all, we could show that the Usher 1 proteins are all colocalized in the ear bundle. Here you can see 3 of them. Initially, they are located along the stereocilia as they grow, and they restricted thereafter to the tip of the stereocilia. Thereafter, it turns out that the air bundle will systematically knock out the gene in the mouth for the 5 genes responsible for Usher 1, and it turns out that in all of them, all of these mutants, we can see a disorganization of the air bundle. It occurs very early during embryonic development, and let's say at postnatal stage, you can see that instead of a normal hair bundle, the stereocilia are grouped in clumps. We could show that both the links, the fibrous link, which had been overlooked before, which extend from a cilium which is translantally associated with the stereocilia and connect the stereocilia just nearby, is composed of cadherin 23 and also of protocadherin 15. Also, the interstereocilia link at embryonic stage are formed with cadherin 23 and protocadherin 15. So this shows that these Usher 1 proteins form links which are essential for the early cohesion of the air bundle. However, having, let's say, showed the critical role of this protein, it was, however, possible that this protein could play a crucial role at later stage. And especially the key question was, are these proteins also involved in the mechanoelectrical transduction process itself? To solve this question, we had to develop conditional knockout in a way that in this conditional knockout mutant, the air bundle developed normally, and only after the full maturation of the air bundle, we could delete the gene for which we were asking whether or not the corresponding protein is involved in mechanotransduction. So here is the result for one of these proteins, SANS, encoded by Usher 1 gene. On this curve, let's say current displacement curve, you can see in blue the conditional knockout mice that the current is absolutely normal in this animal model. However, the amplitude of the current is defective. So the simple hypothesis was that likely the tippling was lost in this conditional knockout model. So we developed this hypothesis, and we could confirm by, let's say, electron microscopy that yes, the tippling was lost, meaning that SANS is involved in the maintenance of the tippling. We also, let's say, developed the same approach for harmonine and come up with similar conclusion, the role also of this USHR1 protein to maintain the tippling. Altogether, we have now the following picture. First of all, showing that, let's say, confirming our initial hypothesis, that the 5 USHR1 genes are involved, let's say, in the same molecular complex, in the sense that, let's say, protocadherin 15 and cadherin 23 form the tippling, and that all 3 other proteins are involved, and I will not go into details now, are involved in the anchoring of the cytoplasmic part of the tippling, the upper part, to the actin filaments. We did the same type of approaches with USHR2 genes, We developed mouse models, and we developed as working hypothesis that the various proteins defective in Usher syndrome type 2 are, let's say, forming a molecular complex. And we could validate this hypothesis by showing that 2 transmembrane proteins which are not cadherin, one of them, and I will get back to it later on, is VLGR1, now called ADGRV1, and also the other one is called Ushrin. This molecular complex is not necessary to have the cohesion of the R bundle, let's say, as shown here, but this is necessary for having the ankle links, and the recording of the mechanotransduction showed us that these links are absolutely essential initially for the R bundle to get its functional polarity. So, altogether, deafness gene led to the identification of components for each of the fibrous links, and also the components, some of the components involved in the anchoring of, let's say, this link to the actin filaments. What we can see here is that, let's say, the USHR1 proteins, as I mentioned, are essential at the level of the mechanoelectrical transduction machinery, forming the tippling and anchoring it. They are also, as the same complex is critical during the embryonic development of the R bundle to obtain the cohesion of the R bundle, and in addition, the same links are also involved to connect transiently the stereocilia with the cilium, which disappear thereafter. So, we also, as I mentioned, the result also enlightened the composition and, let's say, the role of the ankle link complex. And finally, we pull out, again, by genetic approach, a main component of these connectors, which are the connector of the outer air cells. And through this connector, we could get some conclusion regarding the role of the cohesion at adult stage, the cohesion of the R bundle in the mechanoelectrical machinery. So, let's say the genetic approach has 2 other interests. I think that one of the key possibilities is to have situations in which some functions which were initially associated, coupled, thought to be going always together, can be decoupled. And also, in some situations, thanks to the genetic approach, you can connect 2 functions that were initially thought to be not connected. So I will briefly illustrate the coupling of the function revealed by genetics. When we perform postnatal deletion of the component of the mechanoelectrical transduction machinery, here is done at the level of the isoform of protocadherin 15, which is expressed in the adult R bundle. We observe that rapidly there is a decrease in the size of the middle and the small row of stereocilia that you can see here and there. So we could conclude that the mechanotransduction machinery itself is involved in the maintenance, let's say, of the F-actin filament in the stereocilia, we could conclude to a coupling, likely a coupling between the mechanotransduction and the polymerization of F-actin. So this can be due either to the tension itself of the tip link, leaving some space between the membrane and the apical part of the actin filaments for polymerization, or this can be due to the fact that tip link tension opens the mechanotransduction, leaving access to calcium. So now there are some preliminary evidence which at least show that the calcium is very important in the maintenance of the size of the stereocilia rows. So now I will briefly move to the synapse that I'm just anxious. Let's say maybe I should go. How much time? How much time do I have? Sorry?
30 minutes.
I still have 30 minutes? Okay, good. So that is got only 20. Okay, so I will move to the synapse. The characteristic of the synapse the characteristic of the auditory system places quite a lot of constraints in physiological terms at the level of the first synapse of the auditory system between the hair cell and the afferent auditory neurons. So, is it let's say, are these particular physiological properties correlated with some particular molecular machinery, exocytic machinery, being present in these cells? First of all, let's have a look to the inner hair cell synapse. The inner hair cell synapse has not only physiological features highly specific, working very rapidly, being able to sustain during a long time glutamate exocytosis, but it has also morphological specificity. Each presynaptic active zone of the inner hair cell has an electron-dense structure, which is called ribbon, synaptic ribbon. Each active zone, and there are 10 to 15 per inner hair cell, has about 70 vesicles being tethered to the ribbon and 10 to 20 synaptic vesicles tethered between the presynaptic membrane and the ribbon, which are vesicles ready to fuse and called readily releasable pool of vesicles, RP. The rate of sound evoked spike on the inner hair cell afferent neuron can be predicted from both the fusion rate and the replenishment rate of the RP. The synaptic vesicle of the inner hair cell have been, let's say, distributed in three classes. First, the synaptic vesicle being present just, let's say, ready to fuse, just underneath the ribbon, a pool of vesicles associated to the ribbon, and some vesicles being outside the ribbon. Let's say, during the last year, a tentative correlation of, let's say, associating each pool of vesicles with a phase of synaptic exocytosis has been obtained, which led to the following pictures. First of all, the readily releasable pool, of course, corresponds to the first step of exocytosis. The second step is due to a linear phase of release, which is supposed to be due to ribbon-associated pool, and the other vesicles, which are outside, are related to the superlinear phase of release. Let's come back to the inner hair cell presynaptic machinery. Here, a conventional synapse of the central nervous system, which is characterized by the voltage-dependent calcium channels, which is characterized by the presence of the fusogen complex, which is a SNAR complex composed of VAMP and, let's say, the dimer of SNAP25 and syntaxin 1. And in addition, there are some other molecules, especially I'd like to focus on synaptotagmin 1 here, but that could be another synaptotagmin, which is the calcium sensor of the fusion by the SNAR complex of the synaptic vesicle with the presynaptic membrane. And there are other molecules, for instance, MONC13 and complexin. Thanks to knockout mice, it becomes increasingly evident that the exocytic machinery of the inner hair cell synapse has a number of unusual properties. First of all, it was observed that the knockout of all the isoform of MONC13 has no effect on the synaptic release at the level of the inner hair cell. It was also shown that, let's say, the knockout of all complexin form has also no effect. Finally, let's say synaptotagmin 1 and 2 and other synaptotagmin could not be detected at adult stage in the inner hair cell synapse. So the only protein that could be detected was the RIM complex. One of the first genes we pull out as responsible for deafness encoded a protein which was a member of the ferlin family that we called otoferlin. Here are represented the four families of pluri-C2 domain transmembrane proteins. Two of them are anchored to the membrane of the synaptic vesicle by their N-terminal regions, synaptotagmin and extended synaptotagmin. The two others, let's say the multi-C2 transmembrane protein and the ferlin, are anchored by their C-terminal region. This C2 domain, which compose, let's say, the various members of this family, has the following structure. They are composed of 8 beta sheets, which are able to house some calcium ion in the superior loop. So, we asked, what is the role of otoferlin? First of all, we could show that otoferlin is associated with synaptic vesicles. So based on this localization, based also on the role of another ferlin, which has been quite a lot studied, which is this ferlin responsible for a muscle disorder, in which, let's say, the protein is involved in the sealing of the membrane. Based also on the fact that we could not detect any synaptotagmin having an effect after knockout at mature stage, we developed as working hypothesis that likely otoferlin may substitute to synaptotagmin, in other words, may be the calcium sensor of synaptic exocytosis in this very specific synapse. So, we developed knockout mice, and these knockout mice were completely deaf. They had no synaptic exocytosis. However, from this result, it was impossible to conclude in which part of the synaptic vesicle cycle is otoferlin involved. To respond to this question, we engineered some mutant mice, as Tom Sudoff did for the synaptotagmin, in which we substitute some calcium binding sites by, let's say, some aspartate by alanine that don't bind calcium, in order to decrease the affinity of this particular C2 domains to calcium. And this way, we can ask questions: which part of the cycle, of the synaptic vesicle cycle, is affected when, let's say, the calcium concentration is decreased. So we generated these animal models, which are called otoferlin C2C, C2C, and we asked, let's say, as I was mentioning, which part of the cycle is affected. To this purpose, to address the role of calcium and to try to elucidate which step of the synaptic vesicle has a decrease in its calcium sensitivity, we monitor, let's say, the release of the synaptic vesicle, or let's say the fusion, first of all, of the synaptic vesicle with the plasma membrane by using capacitance, by several procedures in which we could modulate the calcium concentration. First of all, by membrane potential variation, depolarization duration, extracellular calcium, let's say, extracellular calcium concentration variation, and directly by increasing rapidly the calcium concentration using, let's say, a UV photolysis of caged calcium. So here are the results. All this approach gave consistent results. During a very short pulse of depolarization corresponding to the fusion of the RRP with the presynaptic membrane, we could observe that the calcium currents has the same amplitude variation in the mutant mice and the wild type mice in black. However, looking to the variation of capacitance as a function of voltage, we could detect a difference which translates in the fact that the calcium affinity of this, let's say, synaptic exocytosis of the readily releasable pool was decreased. Finally, using UV flash photolysis of caged calcium, we could show, first of all, that in both types of mutants, the results in terms of variation in capacitance was the same in wild type and mutant mice, indicating that the pool of vesicle was preserved. And we had also, let's say, other indications that the pool of the vesicle was not modified, the concentration of otoferlin was not different, the ribbon had, let's say, a structure preserved. All of this sustained the fact that it was the proper model to address this question. However, concentrating to the initial response, we could show a delay in the synaptic exocytosis. We thereafter focus on the rate of synaptic exocytosis as a function of time, and again we could see a modification, a slowing down of this rate in the mutants which have a sensitivity to calcium decrease at the level of the C2C domain. Finally, by examining the rate of the fusion now directly as a function of calcium, we could conclude to a major effect of otoferlin, let's say, in the fusion of the synaptic vesicle for the RRP pool with the presynaptic membrane. So this demonstrates for the first time that otoferlin is the calcium sensor, I should say, of the fusion of the presynaptic vesicle with the plasma membrane in the inner air cell at mature stage. So we could also get the following conclusion: the same calcium sensor is also involved in the replenishment of the active zone. So we have here an orchestrator, a calcium orchestrator of the synaptic vesicle cycle. So still, we are facing now the following picture regarding, let's say, the exocytic machinery at the level of the inner air cell. The voltage-dependent calcium channel, cave 1.3, being connected to the rim complex and also being connected with otoferlin. So there is a key question: what about the SNAR complex? Could, for instance, otoferlin being fusogen by itself? We don't have the answer yet. So if it's not the case, what about a SNAR complex being involved as expected? Tobias Moser provides some evidence indicating that neuronal SNAR complex may be absent at least, let's say, at some stage of the development of the inner air cell synapse. So if not the standard, let's say, neuronal SNAR complex, what about another SNAR complex? So this is now the main challenge in our field, and also this has an implication for therapeutic aspects, because, let's say, starting to deciphering as we are doing the role of each of the C2 domain of otoferlin, this is a way to end up possibly with a mini gene, as it has been done for otoferlin, in order to be able to develop easily gene therapy for these forms of deafness, which lead to a neuropathy, which is the third cause of let's say, hearing impairment in Spain. So finally, I'd like to convince you that the genetic approach still has much to offer. All the genetic forms of deafness involve defects, as I said, in the cochlea and or its afferent innervation. And these defects fully account for the observed hearing impairment. However, whatever will be and are and will be in the future, the therapeutic approach attending to restore the, let's say, the functioning of the peripheral auditory system, in any case, we need a proper auditory brain plasticity. Brain plasticity refers to the ability to respond to intrinsic or extrinsic stimuli by reorganizing the structure, reorganizing the connectivity, reorganizing the function of the circuit in the brain. There is a period of maximum plasticity, which is happening just early in postnatal, which is called the critical period. And just to tell you how important is this clinical period, if you use cochlear implant, and presumably you know what a cochlear implant is, the cochlear implantation will be efficient only if, let's say, implanted in children from birth to 3.5 years of age. After, of course, you can try, let's say, using in profoundly deaf children cochlear implant, but the result will be less of a lower quality. So, the importance and, let's say, the brain plasticity at the level of the primary auditory cortex has been first discovered by Michael Merzenich. He reared some juvenile rats in standard acoustic environment showing the development of the tonotopic map within the auditory cortex, and he reared some other rats, in other acoustic environments, either in presence of a pure tone of 4 kHz or 19 kHz or noisy environment. And as a result, as you can see here, the tonotopic map do not form properly, and in addition, there is another representation of the frequency which corresponds to the frequency of the sounds the animals were exposed. So let's now consider children with the congenital profound deafness. Their auditory cortex has never received, except from the spontaneous activity, if persisting, but we can anticipate it that they have not received any information. So, in other words, the auditory cortex is expected to be immature. And what I was mentioning is using any therapy, including the cochlear implant, they will receive some encoded information, electrically encoded information at the level of the auditory nerve, which will drive the maturation of the auditory cortex and the tuning of the development of this auditory cortex in order to be best tuned to the acoustic information they will receive. So all of these scenarios, let's say, implicate that in these children, whatever is the origin of the defect, there is no auditory brain defect. And curiously, this has never been examined. Although, as you anticipate, if there are some brain auditory defects, let's say, the result of any therapy will not be optimal. So we decided to address this question, and we concentrated on two types of caderins, because we know that caderins play a key role in the development of the brain. We concentrated on two caderins. The two caderins I previously discussed, which were initially called protocaderin 15. This was an error. This is not a protocaderin. A protocaderin has 6 to 7 extracellular repeats, but not 11. and the other one is cadherin 23, which has, as I mentioned, 27 extracellular repeats. These two cadherins have been renamed cadherin related. They are identified as belonging to the family of cadherin related. So we first examine the expression of these two cadherins. And to our surprise, we obtain, let's say we observe, the expression of these two cadherins exclusively at that time in the presumptive area of the auditory cortex. As shown here by this double labeling for cadherin related 23 and cadherin related 15, they are both expressed in the same neurons, and according to their localization, we suspected that they could be expressed in the precursor of the GABAergic interneuron, especially par valbumin interneuron or somatostatin positive interneuron. So, thereafter, it's known that this, so we will see the way they emerge. First of all, this type of precursor initially are formed in the medial ganglionic eminence. They then travel through the subpallium and enter in the neocortex through, let's say, a tangential migration, and thereafter they will, let's say, more or less stop in a given region and undergo, let's say, a radial migration up to their final laminar position. So we first ask, can we detect, when can we detect for the first time during the development of GABAergic interneuron the expression of cadherin related 23 and cadherin related 15 in the medial ganglionic eminence? For this, we use the promoter of the MK2 of the MKX2.1 genes, which is specifically expressed in the GABAergic and, let's say, somatostatin GABA interneuron precursors, which emerge from the medial ganglionic eminence. We could observe that using this, let's say, this cray mouse, and let's say, which lead to a cray-dependent expression of the D-tomato marker in red, that, let's say, the proliferating cells of the medial ganglionic eminence did not express cadherin related 23 and cadherin related 15. However, as soon as they leave this subventral and ventral region, they start expressing both cadherins. Thereafter, using the same type of mice, we could show that 5 days later, again, cadherin related 23 and cadherin related 15 are expressed in this precursor labeled with D-tomato and not expressed in other cells. We then asked, do these two cadherins play a critical role in the embryonic migration of these precursors? Here, on the embryonic day 14.5, we can see the double labeling of cadherin related 23 and cadherin related 15 in yellow, and these neurons, let's say, starting to leave the subpallium and to enter in the neocortex. What about this traveling in the absence of the expression of cadherin related 23 or cadherin related 15? Fortunately, when one of these cadherin is missing, the other cadherin is still expressed, so this is possible to trace the migration of this neuron. In the absence of cadherin related 15, as shown here, this interneuron precursor do not enter in the brain. Instead, they scattered in the subpallium. Same thing in the absence of cadherin related 23. This interneuron precursor failed to enter in the neocortex and scattered in the subpallium. So we then ask, which cell population of the auditory cortex of these mouse mutants are affected at adult stage. So, to cut a long story short, we could show the following things. First of all, in order to properly answer this question, we need to have a normal auditory function at the peripheral level, since it's well established that when the auditory function is affected at the peripheral level, there are some consequences at the level of the auditory cortex. So we use as a trick the study of the heterozygote mice for cadherin-related 23 and cadherin-related 15, because they do have a normal peripheral auditory function. And we examine the various inhibitory population in their cortex. And we could come up with the following conclusion. In black circle, let's say, the control mice for the number of parvalbumin neurons in the auditory cortex, and let's say in red and green for the heterozygote mice. Systematically, we observe a decrease in the parvalbumin neurons, which was associated, when the decrease was the highest, to the development of audiogenic seizures. These animals, when they are exposed to sound, let's say, have a type of epilepsy. So this was also consistent with the decrease in the number of the parvalbumin neuron. And finally, we obtained direct evidence supporting this conclusion by deleting cadherin-related 23 gene and cadherin-related 15 gene through a conditional knockout under the promoter on the NKX2.1, these promoters. Likely, only, let's say, the cadherin could be deleted in the precursors of the GABAergic interneuron for parvalbumin and somatostatin neurons. And we observe, in this case, a decrease of the parvalbumin neurons in the auditory cortex. So, this shows that, let's say, the two cadherins, which are when defective, first of all, affect the migration of this class of interneurons, which will thereafter develop as parvalbumin positive interneuron. We were wondering whether or not this finding could be extended to other links of the R bundle. And we address this question by concentrating now not on USHER1 but on USHER2 proteins forming the other types of R bundle links. Again, we knock out the genes and we could come up with the following conclusion, that in this case, although this protein we worked with, we studied, is ADGRV1 and is not expressed in the interneuron precursor. However, in the absence of ADGRV1, this interneuron precursor again failed to enter in the brain, but they did not have, let's say, this abnormal scattering we have observed with cadherin-related 23 and 15. Is it relevant to patients? We are unable to answer this question now, but we examine whether in macaque the pattern of expression of cadherin-related 15 and 22 and ADGRV1 forming these R bundle links are also expressed in medial ganglionic eminence, and we could come up to the conclusion that yes, they are. So, the conclusion are the following. Cadherin-related 23 and 15 identify a subpopulation of parvalbumin interneuron precursors which are targeted exclusively to the auditory cortex. These two cadherins are required for some GABAergic interneuron precursor to enter the neocortex. This is just a suggestion at the present time, the possible existence of an adhesion code such that parvalbumin positive interneuron precursor are endowed with specific adhesion protein guiding them from their birth just after postmitotic stage up to their final destination in a given functional cortical area. In the absence of either of these cadherins, the interneuron precursors embryonic defect appear, and what is important for the patient, it appears well before the defect I initially mentioned at the level of the air bundle. So the air bundle is not yet formed, that already there is a defect at the level of the at the central auditory level. As I mentioned, another key air bundle protein forming also links, ADG-RV1, is required for the entry of cadherin-related 23 and cadherin-related 15 expressing interneuron in the auditory cortex. So altogether, this means that the peripheral and the central auditory system share key proteins. How did this sensory system evolve such that key proteins serve apparently two different functions at the peripheral and the central level? And the key question is, do other sensory systems display also this characteristic? We have shown that audiogenic seizure, the seizure elicited by loud sound, can result from a decrease in parvalbumin positive interneuron in the auditory cortex only. So, audiogenic seizure susceptibility genes emerge as a promising approach for a genetic dissection of the development and the functioning of the auditory cortex, and especially, as we anticipate, with respect to the excitatory-inhibitory balance. So the question is the following one. Among the various deafness genes which are responsible for peripheral auditory defects, how many, and let's say, do we have, and how many genes are also responsible for auditory central disorders? So I can tell you that we have now 4 additional genes responsible for deafness in which we can detect audiogenic seizure in the animal models. Finally, with respect to patients, the results predict poor cochlear implantation outcome in patients with cadherin-related 23 and 15 or ADG-RV1 defect, because parvalbumin positive interneurons are especially important for brain plasticity, and this prediction borne out in recent reports in deaf patients carrying mutations in cadherin-related 15 and or associated, in some cases, with cadherin-related 23 gene defect. Can we detect the intrinsic cortical defect revealed in the mouse mutants in patients? This is one of the next challenge. Cortical defect, that means, should progressively sought in patients with various forms of deafness, focusing initially on the inherited form of deafness, for which finding in animal models suggests that they may be affected by an intrinsic cortical defect. And as a result of this knowledge, we think that auditory rehabilitation, which is currently empiric in nature, should progressively acquire scientific basis, with auditory training adapted to the cortical deficit, maybe that's a dream, and the possibility to develop some cortical therapy in the future. So, I'll stop here. Here is my team at the Pasteur Institute, and more specifically, I would like to thank those who performed the work I have been presented, let's say the recent work on otoferlin, especially Nicolas Michalski, Saïd Sefiadine, Jacques Boutet-de-Monvel, and Didier Dulon, and the work on cadherin-related 23 and cadherin-related 15, again Baptiste Libet-Philippot, again Nicolas Michalski, and Vincent Michel. I'd like also to warmly thank all of our collaborators throughout the world. First of all, let's say the geneticists and the clinicians in a lot of countries with high consanguinous, high level of consanguinity. Let's say some friends in the UK, and also I'm teaching in Beijing, have a close collaboration with Qiu Zhuang, and we have several collaborations, especially now either with respect to basic science or to the development of gene therapy approaches that I will discuss tomorrow, and especially with Larry Lustig. And for the work we did at the level of the brain, I'd like to warmly thank the contribution of Christine Métain. So finally, and let's say last but not least, our sponsor, and I would like also to thank you for your attention.